Everybody, this is the second video from an insight. I'm going to focus on the clinical update. There's a lot of important information this week, so please hang in there to the end. If you have not seen my first video, please take a look because I go into what's happening to the virus across the world, the US and California. And this is a picture of the virus in blue with the spikes attacking a cell. So just a reminder of everybody there, roughly 30 to 50% of people are asymptomatic. Around 80% develop mild to medium symptoms there, 20% end up in a hospital there. If you're in a hospital there, around a third end up on a ventilator, and that's where you have the high mortality rate of 25 to 58%. If you're on oxygen in a non-ICU ventilator, the mortality rate is 10 to 30%. Now, we're going to talk today that there's some issue on long-term recovery, not only for people at the hospital, but also for people with mild to medium case, and that's really worrisome. So as a reminder, you have a viral response from the time you get infected, even before you have the symptoms, so that's where you're the most infectious. And then that viral load goes down, which means it's harder to test them. So when you get tested, it's important to know where you are in the progression of the disease. And then you start building antibodies and a T cell response, which we're going to talk about today, during the time period. And this is where we're having a problem around day 7 to 10. Some people have the cytokine storm where they lose control of the inflammation response. And that's how you end up in the hospitals with all this complication there. So let's go over what we know and what we don't know. What we know is mask, social distancing, and hand washing works. It works in Asia, it works in Europe, and most countries are able to use those tools to stop the spread of the virus. It's important we start doing this in the US. We also know that children have half the risk rate of getting sick. So if they get exposed to the same amount of viral load, they have 50% lower chance of getting sick. But 70% of them are asymptomatic. And that's the problem there because they can carry the virus without any symptoms into the family and other loved ones. We know that around day 7 to 10, some people that we don't fully understand yet end up with a cytokine storm where they lose control of the inflammation response, end up being in hospitals there. We know that around 40 to 50%, multiple data as high as 80% of people are asymptomatic. We also know that the indoor transmission is significantly worse than outdoor transmission. We'll talk about today about air conditioning and airflow and all of that, which is one of the problems indoor. We also know the virus mutated in Germany in early March and took over the rest of the world. If you haven't seen that, it's one of my prior videos. And unfortunately, that virus is 5 times more contagious. It has 5 times more spikes. And so it's a much more virulent virus than was at the beginning of this pandemic. We also know that it's not age that drives the bad outcome, it's pre-existing condition. We also have discussed in the last couple of weeks the fact that in the US, this virus is behaving that it needs a minimum amount of people to create a pandemic. And it's believed that 10% of the events or the people are driving 80% of the transmission. These are the super spreading event of super spreading people there. And I'm going to talk today about the immunity. We're learning that T cells, which is our antibody system, data is coming up this week, show they may have a long-lasting memory to protect us. What we don't know yet is when are we going to get a safe and effective vaccine? We don't know how long the antibody lasts. Therefore, that's an issue for vaccine because vaccine is trying to stimulate antibodies. And we start to get all this data that shows a potential long-term damage of COVID, which is not fully confirmed there. So again, as a reminder, is that we first found that the disease was attacking the lungs. Now we have discovered it's really everywhere. It's attaching to that ACE2 receptor there, and there's a lot of damage into the inner lining, the endothelium of the cardiovascular system, which create blood clots in a very high percent of the population there. So as a result of that, it attacks everywhere in the body. And if you haven't seen my prior video, please go back because I go into a lot of details about that. So why is the mortality rate decreasing? And if you look at the mortality rate, we're seeing the average age is going downwards from what happened in France and Italy, which was really the older population. US, the average age of mortality is 35 to 40 years old there, if you do the scope. And I think, the data is there. As we're moving to developing countries like India and Brazil, that population is a younger population. We have, unfortunately, the problem in the US that the younger population is not wearing masks, so therefore get a high risk to get infected. But pretty much we're starting to move in some of these areas there from the pre-existing condition, which is what happened in Europe. These are the people who died with people who had cardiovascular problem and other problems there, to the socio-economic drivers like we just saw in California in the first video, where people living in high population density, where there's poverty, with poor access to care, these are the people who unfortunately seems to be have a high mortality rate. So if you look at my first video there, the Latino population has a significantly higher risk, like the Black population, between 2 to 6x, depending on the age group. We also know that we have learned a lot from New York and Italy. And so we have better protocols and we intervene much faster. I'm going to talk today about all the update on the treatment. So we start to get effective drugs. And there's a delay in the deaths being reported. As we're having that rise in the number of cases, there's a 3 to 6 weeks delay in the rise in fatality rates. The other thing that's a bit more worrisome is that we're starting to realize that measuring deaths is not maybe what we need to measure. It is one outcome, but there's a lot of additional people who have an adverse outcome that's not death related. And the data that I'm going to share a little bit today is that a lot of this is happening on people who are asymptomatic. We are discovering that people who are asymptomatic have lung damage. And we're discovering that people who have had severe cases, even if they recover from the hospitals, have long-term damage. So let's kind of go into some of this. Let me talk a little bit about the science. So most of the younger population are being protected by the innate immunity. This is what you're born with. This is your skin, your barrier that protects you. And then we have what's called the adaptive immunity. This is what we start to build as we age. And the adaptive immunity, every time you get exposed to a cold, that's how you build the antibodies. So it helps you the next year. Now, there are some diseases where you build antibody for your life, and other diseases, like this coronavirus, where it may only protect you for a few months. And there's two types of immune cells. There's a B cell, and they attack the invader outside the cell. So if they see the virus outside the cell, they try to stop it. And then there's the T cell, which are really important because they attack the infected cell. So they recognize a cell that's infected, and the first was called apoptosis before the cell continued to infect other part of the body. So let's take a little bit of a second there in innate versus adaptive immunity. At the high level there, I'm going to focus on adaptive because that's where some of the data this week came out, is really understanding there's these B cells and these T cells. And when we look at antibodies, this is the one that doesn't last very long. This is the one we're worried about. This is the one when we do the test of the people who are survivors, that numbers, a third of them had no antibodies. Another third didn't have antibodies after 30 to 60 days. What is coming in the news this week is that the T cells, which last much longer, may be protective. So let me kind of go into this. And for people who really don't know what to do this weekend there, you can read this article there. It's really heavy. It just got published in Nature. And it looked at the T cell, which has been built by prior infection you have had in the past. And they're showing that these T cells, the way they're operating, may provide some protection to some people, which may explain why some people just get mild to medium cases and other people lose control, because it could be based on the prior infection they've been exposed to before and what type of protection the body has built. And so they have discovered that the SARS of 2003, which was the first coronavirus, that it provided immunity up to 17 years. And that could be great news if we could confirm that, because they believe it could be a cross immunity to the COVID. And that may explain why some people, are protected. And so what's been interesting in their data, they found uninfected patients, so people who have not been exposed to the virus, had that immunity in the way they were doing the analysis of their T cells. So that if that continues to get confirmed, it may explain why some people get exposed and don't really get very sick, and other people get very, very sick based on their prior history of having been infected by other diseases. So we'll keep an eye on that. They confirmed that the viral load exposure is important. In other words, the T cells can only fight you for so much of an invasion. So if you have a small invasion, because you had a mask and you got a few particles that you get exposed to, the T cell may be able to control it. If you have a high dose, which they call the inoculum, the T cells will be overwhelmed. Again, reinforcing the fact that we may have an adaptive immunity already from our prior diseases, but you really have to protect the amount of exposure to this disease. So that's hopefully some good news. We keep an eye on that. And that's important because, as I explained earlier, the antibodies, which is the the um, don't last very long, where the T cell lasts much longer in the body. They last for years. So that could be good news. I will keep an eye on that. So here's the concern that people have. This is the people are getting sick of the virus. This is the first wave. And then there's that people are untreated for COVID condition. And then there's the problem that we think there's long-term lasting damage that's starting to be exposed. And that starts to come out of Italy and New York, which are people who have had enough of a time period there after 2 to 3 months for people to go back to the hospital to say, I'm having all these weird symptoms. What is this? And it seems to be affecting the brain, the lungs, the kidneys, and the heart. So let's take a look at some of them. We took some of this last week. We are discovering that even people who are asymptomatic, who did not know they were exposed, have lung damage when they do x-rays. I'm repeating this slowly. People are asymptomatic with mild or very low symptoms. And they complain afterwards of having breathing problem, and they do an x-ray, they find out that for no other reason they have been exposed to the COVID, they have damage to their lungs. We're also discovering that, people have had blood clots. This disease, 30 to 40% of people develop blood clots. And of course, blood clots have consequences. It could create stroke and heart attacks. And even some people have lost their legs because there's a blockage of the blood flow. So a long list of problems there. Italy did a study on post-recovery there. And what they find out is that 87% of people 60 days after having been exposed to the disease have persistent symptoms, chronic fatigue being a leading one, problem breathing, joint pain, clearly an inflammation response problem into the body there. This just came out this week. They did, people had some problems there. They look at the database of 69 countries of people who did a heart scan of somebody who had COVID. So it's a subpopulation there. And they discovered that 55%, when they did this echocardiography, 55% has a normal heart scan. And this is the scary part. 45% of the mild case had a problem too in their data sets there. So 74% of these patients had no heart disease or any cardiovascular problem before they got exposed to COVID. So this disease is not just you got lucky and 80% of people are fine. Those people end up with some damages, and we're just starting to learn this. This was published in European heart journals there. We have to, get a caveat there. This was an observational study. They did not do study of everybody. There's now UCSF and several centers now are doing studies, but that may take 1 to 2 years before we have those results. So it's something to keep an eye on. We talked last week about the fact we're discovering more and more people having cognitive function problems. Some of them have what's called delirium and hallucination, where they just have severe damage to the brain due to brain inflammation. Of course, if you get a blood clot like this person had there, that could be devastating. So, and this is the scary part. This doesn't happen at the beginning of the disease. This happens at the end tail of the recovery period there. So, another information that came out this week is that the ambient temperature, the relative humidity and the precipitation may be a driver of the infection rate. And when they did an analysis that got published by a German paper of 12,000 respiratory infection, and they believe there's a relationship with low ambient temperature. And remember, I showed a week ago that if the relative humidity was below 40%, the infection rate in the hospitals was 4 to 5 times higher. So it's consistent to what they're finding here. So it may also explain why Brazil and some of the hotspots we see in Africa there, which is we have a higher precipitation there, as well as the East Coast. Maybe some of the reason there, as well as Mexico, where we're having some of these outbreaks. So interesting data set. Let's talk about the treatment. As a reminder, when you get the viral infection there, you have that viral load. And this is when we start to treat antivirals, even before some people get into the hospital there, as well as immune booster. And I'll talk a bit more about that. If you're unfortunate that you end up with a complicated case, then we'll talk about anti-inflammatory, anticoagulant, vasodilator, and mucolytic. So I'll talk a bit about all this. So the type of treatment you need, depending where you are in that curve of the treatment of the disease. So a review just came out, and I added to that about what are the treatment. And this is great things that have happened in the last 3 to 5 months, which is why I think you see the mortality rate going down a little bit, is that we have different categories. One is to help the immune system. And that's during the infection period at the beginning of the viral load. And then if you lose control of the immune system, so you have to fine tune this, then we're trying to suppress it because that's where you do most of the damage because the inflammatory response is too high. And these are the steroid and some of the technology I'll explain. And then if you unfortunately end up in a hospital there, we're going to optimize your ventilation. What we learn is that if you're in the prone position, which is you're on your tummy, and we give you oxygen therapy, you basically can keep you alive. And then we mitigate the damage. We know that this disease is a train wreck inside your body there. So using anticoagulant, we decrease the chance of a blood clot doing some damage. A lot of people end up on kidney dialysis. 20% of the patients end up on kidney dialysis. So you want to be proactive before there's too much damage to the kidney, which may be irreversible. So let's look at the one that has strong evidence that it works, which most of the hospitals now are using in their protocol. One is remdesivir, which is a drug from Gilead. It is only approved for severe hospital cases in the ICU because it's an intravenous. It stopped the virus from replicating by inserting itself into the gene. So it's basically fooling the virus so it stops multiplying itself. The outcome is not having an impact on mortality, it's just decreasing the length of stay by 30%, so from 15 to 11 days. Another drug that came out from a study done by the British, they discovered is this cortisone, the steroid called dexamethasone, which is very cheap. It's an oral drug, very low cost. And if you use it on patients who are on ventilator or on oxygen, a supplement there, it reduced the death rate by a third. That's a big deal because mortality rate on ventilator is pretty high. And also by 20% of people who are on oxygen cannulas there. There's a belief that if you take it too early, because it's slowing down your immune system, if you give it during the time period at the beginning there, I was explaining that which you're fighting the infection, that could hurt you. So it's very important. Nobody takes this medication unless there's a physician that provides oversight. The prone positioning was a big deal that we discovered in New York, that if we put people on their bellies instead of their back, which is what we used to do, that we open up the lungs and really help the person breathe. Ventilator and oxygen therapy, we have learned that putting somebody on a ventilator too quickly is not good. You really need to do it progressively, give them a cannula, which goes into your nose. If that doesn't work, you put a face mask so you have a deeper pressure there, and ultimately end up on the ventilator. We know this is the highest mortality rate. And then we discovered that anticoagulants can have a big impact in decreasing this complication I mentioned, like strokes and limb loss and kidney failures and the famous comatose, where you basically have problem in perfusions there. So we know that basically the virus is attacking the lining of blood cells, which is impacting therefore most of the organ in the body there. So the good news is that we're starting to use all these medications in the last 2 to 3 months. What's promising is convalescent plasma. We have already done 58,000 doses. And because the blood bank, as they're collecting blood from survivors there, they're harvesting and they're storing the plasma there. And it seems to be dropping the death rate by 50%. Again, this is not something that you can use if you are in the mild to medium case. This is something if you are in the hospitals there and in the ICU. And we take the blood of recovered patients and we harvest the antibodies. We also have a new technology called cytosorb. And what you do is that when you have that cytokine storm, they're getting your blood to go 70 times to this machine. So as a filter that remove the cytokine. It's a bit of a brute force, but it got FDA approval for several clinical trials, and it's processed in academic centers. If people are at risk of kidney injuries they're being put on kidney dialysis to just minimize the risk of damaging the kidney cells, because when the kidney cells are killed, they don't come back. And so it's really important that we have to be proactive about that. As a rule of thumb, 20% of patients in the ICU end up on dialysis. So it is clearly attacking the kidney. These are people with no other reasons about having kidney problems. There's this drug called lenzilumab. There's a small study from Mayo Clinic. Again, it's an intravenous that seems to have an impact that's even better than remdesivir, where they decrease the severity of the storm, the cytokine storm, from 10 days to 5 days. So these are great news because that means we're getting more and more treatment that works in the hospital setting. Mixed results so far is some of the antivirals. There's a company in India called Biofor that's working on a drug called favipiravir, and it's making the virus clearing, the viral load clearance much faster there. They're scaling up manufacturing in India, Turkey, and Russia. And so, of course, they're going to be testing this in India. There's another antiviral, which is oral, which is much easier to use than intravenous, which is Ridgeback, which is working with Merck. And it's protecting the airway epithelial. So this is the entry point of a lot of the virus is into the lung. So if we could block the spread of the virus at the entry point, that's what they're trying to do. They just started human trials. There's another approach, which is to kind of fake the virus. So remember, the virus attached to the ACE2 receptors there. And the idea is to have artificial ACE2 protein that's a decoy. It's like the submarine wars. To basically distract the virus, not to basically penetrate into the cell. And these are recombinant ACE2 proteins, but they haven't been done in animals, in the humans yet. And then there's monoclonal antibodies. You may have heard about it. The company called Regeneron has been in the news, as well as Lilly. And it's a synthetic virus antibody that's being built. And the idea is to do injections there. They're entering a phase 3 with 1,850 people hospitalized and 1,000 who are non-hospitalized. And it's the first time we see something for the non-hospitalized patient. That's really important there because, because there's mild to medium cases, they need some help to be treated. Another tentative drugs is interferon. You may have heard that term. And so the interferon are the protein that are the natural response of the body there. And so the idea is to give you an injection to rouse your immune system to kick into higher gear. Another treatment is cytokine inhibitors, and they stop that cytokine storm. They have different mechanism of action there, but again, the whole idea is that as you're losing control of that cytokine storm, you're trying to stop the progression of it. There's been a lot of talk about stem cell. It's a little bit unclear if it works. In the past, it hasn't worked in a viral type of situation there, so we'll see if it can stop the inflammatory cascade. A drug called ivermectin, we talked last week there. This is a drug that's being used in some countries outside the US for parasitic infection. And there's been some very interesting data being published there. The FDA, of course, issued a warning letter to say it should not be used in the US because it's for animals. So there's outside the US, there's several drugs in Asia and South America there to see if it's effective. It's a cheap drug and it's easy to use. Russia has approved a drug called Coronavir, and it stopped again the replication of the virus. And they see 55% of improvement of patient. Again, if we could get people some treatment before they have the cytokine storm, this is where you can stop the propagation of the virus. So these are all good news. Of course, these are outside the US. Drugs that don't make it, all the HIV drugs, combo drugs don't work, and the World Health Organization has stopped the clinical trials. And then there is our favorite subject, hydroxychloroquine, which is like a soap opera. It was pushed for a while, and then it was withdrawn by the FDA and the World Health Organization when data showed that it doubled the mortality rate in hospitals and the ICU. On July the 2nd, the Henry Ford Medical Center published a paper that showed that maybe if you give it early, within the first 48 hours of admission to the hospital, that may have an impact. Yesterday or 2 days ago, July 16, University of Minnesota came up to say, no, it doesn't work on mild patients there. So I think my takeaway is that don't take it. It's clearly going the wrong direction as far as the clinical data. A quick vaccine trials update. I spent a lot of time in the past. I'm just going to do a quick update. There's 271 treatment, so that goes up every week. If you're interested in participating in the vaccine trials, this is a website that you can sign up. Now, remember, you may be a control or you may get the real drugs. But if you're interested, and these trials are trying to find thousands of people there. So this is a website where you can register to participate into any of these vaccine trials. There's 197 vaccines right now at different stages. Around 12 to 15 are into human phase 1 to phase 2 trials. Moderna has just released some data this week to show that they stimulate the B and the T cell. This is, remember what I showed earlier, that it's very important there because the T cell, it lasts longer. And it's at a level that's higher than the survivor antibodies that we can measure today. So that's good news. China has approved the use of their drugs, which is still in clinical trials phase 2 in Canada, to be used by their military. So we'll see how that works. Oxford and AstraZeneca is one of the most promising vaccine, and they started the phase 3 trials in Brazil and South Africa, which is where they have the hotspot. Inovio is technology there where they're pushing the molecule through the skin pores by using electrical technology there to open the pores. And so that's a nice way to propagate it, because some of these other vaccines need to be shipped at minus 80 degrees Celsius, which is not easy for logistics across the world. They have had a 94% response rate in 36 patients, still a small group, but all positive. Sinopharm is doing 1,000 patient trials and claim that majority build antibodies. Synvovio is an interesting technology. They use a probiotic pill that could protect you for a few hours, which is a new approach. Pfizer and BioNTech is some of these giants there. They've done 24 patients, and they produce more antibody than infected people. So these are all great results so far. Again, limited data. This is the Russian in the Gamaleya Institute. They injected themselves with a modified adenovirus vector. Again, that's give them courage to do that. So hopefully everybody is still alive. Janssen and J&J is deploying clinical trials in Europe and Belgium in doing non-replicating adenovirus trials, and Merck has bought a company called Themis, and which is taking the measles vector because we believe it's protective, using a technology that can be scaled up very quickly there. Let's talk about vaccine that exists. We've talked about the famous BCG vaccine for tuberculosis, and it boosts that T cell I was telling you about. And there's now another paper that just came out that for every 10% increase in the BCG index, you have a 10% reduction in mortality of COVID. And they did this extensive analysis that just got published to show that you can clearly see that depending on how much you still have protection in your body there based on when the population were vaccinated over the years, you can see there's a lower mortality rate, and it looks like it's a pretty good relationship. And so anyway, so that continued to be investigated there as a potential booster of the immune system. This was an interview of the CEO of Merck. Merck is one of the biggest company that makes vaccine. And he basically, to give some reality check, is that the Ebola vaccine took 4.5 years to go to market, because we have to show it's safe, effective, and he emphasized durable. What we don't know is, as you're boosting these antibodies, how long did they last in the body? Remember, we see the survivors, some of them don't have antibodies after a few months. So that's a big thing, is just to say how long are lasting, and that's a question mark we don't know. To give a reference check, it's in the last 25 years, only 7 new vaccines against a pathogen were approved and discovered. So, of course, 4 of them by Merck. And then they discovered the swine flu vaccine, did more harm than good. So we have to make sure that these are safe vaccines. He said we really need to wear a mask, social distancing, and learn new behavior. We need to overcome that individualism I talked in the first video. And then he's very concerned about the ultra-nationalistic approach where people are hoarding and buying 300 to 400 million doses, 1 to 2 years ahead of time, and how we're going to basically share it across the world. And sometime we have to cover 7.5 billion people. And so anyway, it's always a very interesting conversation. There has been a lot of conversation about airborne. And so let me kind of go through this. So when we talk about droplets, these are the size of the thing that comes out of your mouth that's over 5 microns. These are heavy, and so they drop into the floor within 3 to 6 feet. Of course, they could be on a contaminated door or surface and last for a few days. What people are talking about is aerosol. Aerosol are less than 5 microns, so they're really tiny particles there. Because they're so tiny, they stay in the air. They're suspended in the air. They don't drop down. And they're like pollen. Pollen kind of stay in the air for a long period of time. Therefore, the medical mask may not protect you there because there's a limit of 2.5 microns on some of this mask, and it could go through. And so the 6 feet separation may not be enough. So what's the data, and what do we know? There's experimental data showing that, these aerosol, which are these tiny particles, they can go as far as 27 feet, and they can stay in the air for a few hours. There is a belief that this virus may not be as bad as what people have been saying there. That the issue is the ventilation in the air. And so they did the statistics, and they say that the biggest transmission is between 10 to 40% of the transmission are people who live in the same household. That means you touch and you have a lot of surface that could be contaminated. If you share a meal, they only have a 7% with somebody who's infected of getting sick. If you have interaction when people are shopping, it's 0.6%. So the analysis they show is that maybe at most 5% of people may end up having the virus because of this aerosol. The leading cause is still these big droplets is what the problem is. And really the way to control that is to have be outdoors as much as you can, have well ventilated, because the aerosols, through the airflow will go away. So let's talk about ventilation. And really what we're trying to do is to kind of get rid of this aerosol that's in the air there. Now, the easiest way is that you open the air and you open the windows and you have an airflow between this. But now let's talk about a lot of the buildings, the school buildings and where people work. They have an air cleaning and disinfection system there. And we don't know if it's really safe right now. There's a lot of discussion to say, what are we going to do with the ventilation system in buildings? And of course, if you look about what's the most effective way, if we can eliminate the pathogen, that takes care of it. If we now have to invest in some engineering controls to change the way we do the ventilation inside buildings, that's a lot of more work. And so, but it can be very effective. Of course, the last resort is to get a mask, and gown. So what the country is doing right now is fighting to use the mask. Well, we need to start talking about how can we start going upwards and using UV lights and different type of ventilation system to stop the pathogen to be in the room. Okay. And so as a result of that, we need to avoid air recirculation. When you recirculate the air, you get basically re-exposed to the airborne. You need to avoid being overcrowding, because that means the airflow is not going through that room in an effective manner. And so there's a couple of ways you could do that. One is that you can have clean outdoor air. You force the air to go from the outside inside, which is the reverse of what a lot of ventilation are doing, which is exactly the reverse, where we're pushing the air out. And so we need to look at the HVAC, I can never say this right, which is the indoor air handling system that most of the large buildings are having. We need to look at the air exchange per hour. We need to maybe change that exchange depending on how many people are in that room or what time of the day, because we know there's a high amount of particle there. So we need some smarts as opposed to having the same fan. And if we have too much exchange, you may have some issue with relative humidity and all these other things there. So we need to put some smarts in how we're managing this. We need to measure the level of CO2, because the level of CO2 will give an indication about how overcrowded that room is and how poor the ventilation is. So the technology does exist to do all the things we're talking about. But we need to also add to that maybe some germicidal ultraviolet lights into the ducts. So even if the air that's contaminated goes into the ducts, we basically kill it there. We need to totally rethink how we do ventilation. And this came out from several articles, and there's several groups who sets the standards, who are kind of working on this. And I think it's an investment and liability that companies have to do. It's pretty much expected that 60% of the systems that are in the building right now do not have this high level of filtrations. And we discussed that a little bit there in some of the prior videos there. So keep an eye on this, because ventilation is an easy thing we can do from our home. Open the windows there. And in Europe, for example, they start to open the doors and the windows of schools to force that air filtration there as a way to kind of make the schools safer. To give you an idea, if you go to data centers, I know some of you are from the IT world there, it's really important to manage the temperature of the data center. There's all these hotspots and all that. And the way they're doing it, they're taking the air from under the floor, it's called the plenum there, and they are forcing the air to circulate upwards. It's much more efficient. It's also forcing the pathogen away from you. Because the last thing you want to do is the pathogen going up in the air, like what we do right now, which is most of the building have a ceiling plenum, and that's why they basically push it downwards. So you basically have this virus from this person that goes up and is being pushed downwards to this other person. And if you remember a couple of videos ago, we talked about this cold center in South Korea there, where pretty much the whole floor got it, because it went through the air conditioning upwards and it was recirculated to the rest of the building and the rest of the floor. So it's going to be interesting, a new discussion for large companies to say, you cannot overnight change all your system there, but this technology have been proven, and maybe for area of high density, people may have to invest in changing the way we're doing the ventilation, the filtration, and disinfection of this airflow. So keep an eye on that. Goldman Sachs came out with an analysis showing that if Americans were willing to wear a mask, we could save 5% of GDP. That is a massive number. And they did this analysis by looking at the decrease of real activity there. So initially in March, we didn't do too much. And then we started getting more and more into a clampdown in Italy, and China did full lockdown. And they were able to basically have a reopening of the economy much faster there. Another way they looked at this is a relationship between the time it took for a mandate to wear a mask, and in this case it's weeks, and the relationship with having more cases and high fatality rates. So the irony of what we're doing right now is that the more we're delaying, and we have this political discussion about wearing masks and not wearing masks, the worse we're making it to ourselves. And the data is pretty clear cut, a lot of you scientists, that, wearing a mask and the delaying wearing the mask basically help propagate the disease and having a higher mortality rate. As a result, we're having now permanent layoff. And as I said, a study just came out this week that 110,000 small businesses just shut down permanently, and there's going to be more. The unemployment rate, there's been 51 million Americans who filed for unemployment. That's stunning numbers. So just to get you to think differently, this is in Silicon Valley there. How are we going to change the way we do things in Silicon Valley? A lot of things in the Valley is what's called serendipity encounters. I'm meeting this guy who's an engineer who knows this other guy who has another idea. And then we basically have a cup of coffee in one of the famous places around here. And we come up with an invention. And the Googleplex, the Apple Park, a lot of these were designed to stimulate this what's called these encounters, to stimulate creativity, all of that. How are we going to do this, with Zoom? That's to be seen how that's going to work out. And the other thing that's happening right now is tech companies are removing the worker, a lot of the white collar workforce. Facebook, Google, and Twitter, they say the rest of this year you can work from home. Clearly we're not going to try to open the office. And so some of them are saying over 50% of their employees may be remotely working permanently. So the whole idea of Silicon Valley, which was this little incubator there where these people meet and they come up with the financial person meeting the commercial person, meets the inventors, who meet the manufacturing guy, and we somehow become with a startup. We have to see what's going to do there. And already the rent in San Francisco dropped by 11% because people are leaving San Francisco because they can work remotely in much cheaper area. So stay tuned. The other thing that's coming up is credit card losses. We talked 1 or 2 weeks ago about the fact that most of the banks now are shutting down their credit card insurance there because they don't know how to rate credits. They also this week took $28 billion of reserve because they expect a lot of their loans, including mortgages, I think 30% of mortgages were late or not paid yet because of the virus there. So we don't want a financial crisis being triggered by this. So that's something to keep an eye on, because the financial system may be under major distress in the next 6 months if that happens. So thank you very much for listening there. If you haven't seen, please watch my other video on the epidemiology, which is the virus spread across the world. Thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.